perhaps because I can see the participants on my screen, but I expect that maybe people are joining us from many different continents, which it would be very interesting and very pleasant. So today we have a seminar um, with the title Gnosticism and New Religions, the case of Hubbard. We had a session with the same title and the same speakers at the European Academy of Religion the last August, September, end of August and beginning of September. Unfortunately, we had, because it was one of the first sessions of this called hybrid sessions, and for technical reasons, the session didn't go very, very well. And many people could not connect to our session. So, and as session was really of the high quality and very interesting, so it was decided to repeat the session again. So if some of you already were participating in the session, don't be offended, because it will be the replica of the same one, only in a different system and perhaps the different nuances. So religion, we have noticed, most of us, that religion had a difficult time during the COVID-19 crisis. And looking at it from like comparing it with the different great epidemics of past centuries, we have noticed that at these times before, most people turned to religion for understanding the terrible events they were witnessing. This time, rather than religious leaders, this time, rather than religious leaders, doctors and virologists were asked for the words that could give meaning to the epidemic. And here has been worse than that. In several countries, it was the fear of the sacred that took over. And if religion and the sacred were among the great culprits of the epidemic, a case in point is the persecution of the Korean new religious movement, Shincheonji, after one of its members was misdiagnosed with a common cold and allowed to participate in religious gatherings, where she set in motion events that led to thousands of her co-religionists being infected. The 90-year-old leader Shincheonji was put in jail before a Korean court declared that he had not committed any crime and had cooperated with the health authorities as it was reasonably possible. More generally, the entire field of religion was perceived not as a resource at this time, but as a problem, and religious gatherings were denounced more harshly by the authorities in the media than sport or political events, where thousands also gathered, creating epidemiologic risks. However, it would be wrong to say that religion disappeared during the COVID-19. Religious charities, including some operated by new religious movements, have been among the most active organizations in providing relief to victims. As I have discussed in my small book on the subject, Scientology was very much active in offering help. Another interesting phenomenon has been an explosion of interest in online retreats, meditation, and prayer offered by both major religions and minorities. This session deals with Gnosticism, an ancient form of religion that developed in the first centuries of the Christian era and tried to go beyond the distinctions between God and the world, and between different parts of the human compound, insisting they were all one. Scholars such as Gordon Melton and also Aldo Natale Terin, who is with us today, have described Scientology's worldview as a return, in modern terms, of ancient Gnosticism. Scientology distributed masks and disinfectant, but also proposed in its websites and booklets a Gnostic narrative of the pandemic. Scientology teaches that the basic essence of humans is an immortal spiritual being known as Titan. In its Gnostic foundation, myth, Titans have forgotten their spiritual identity and believe they are human bodies, while accordingly to the Scientology, they merely inhabit subsequent human bodies, one reincarnation after the other. Scientology reminds Titans of their divine origin, making them realize that they are cause rather than effect of the universe. During the pandemic, Scientology invited its members and the general public to read a text by its founder, Ron Hubbard, on the notion of dangerous environments, teaching us, I quote, a person is either the effect of his environment or is able to have an effect upon his environment. The truth is that man is as successful as he adjusts to the environment to him. End of quote. This is vintage Scientology, as the Titans who believe they are the effect of the universe should realize that they are in fact its cause and creators, based on the Gnostic notion that we create reality rather than being determined by it. That this is at the very heart of the ideas of Ron Hubbard. It is to these ideas that we turn now. So today, as speakers, we have Professor Aldo Natale Tarin, who is the Distinguished Scholar of Religion from Pontifical Institute of Santa Giustina in Padova. He is the author of one of the best books on Scientology. And I give the floor to Professor Aldo Natale Tarin. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the presentation, and I will be speaking about Gnosticism and Scientology and parallelism. Research have begun in the last decades to investigate Scientology intellectual history. For example, comparing Scientology with Buddhism, Hinduism, New Thought, Theosophy, general semantics. But they have not yet investigated enough Scientology and Gnosticism present in Ron Hubbard's thought. Why Scientology is so near to Gnosticism? We know that Scientology's depth to the Gnostic traditions is very deep and has multiple meanings, not only for the opposition between spirit and flesh, Satan and the master in Scientology, but also, for example, in stressing the essence itself of knowledge as particular experience, bringing to the knowing how to know. According to Hubbard, this is, and by the interpretation of time and space, which are the coordinates not only of the physical world, but of the mind itself. We have now the task to fill the gap and to investigate in particular on the meaning, on the sense of knowledge in the context of the Gnostic religion. And the last but not least, a question about historical genesis should be clarified. We can ask from which or from what Ron Hubbard did possess the historical source for knowing the Gnosticism. This is a problem. The only source is perhaps the new thought of theology or the theosophy. I doubt. Synthetically, first, I would repeat here the same principles I have commented in my book about Scientology. First, God is absolutely transcendent, and far from us. Second, thereby we see an introduction of new gods, a transformation of the same deities near to the man. In Scientology, that corresponds to the spirit. Satan, that are like deities. Third, beyond these deities, this is a conception of the world as matter. Scientology must that is lapsed. Then, specifically, there is an introduction of the demiurge as a minor god. Scientology, the myth of the spirit, exists beyond death, exists the explanation of this fact through the dramatic mythology, where the divine element falls on the earth, and it remains hidden like a divine spark. Only the preserve of the knowledge of this spark is the beginning of the turn towards the divine. In Scientology, these principles correspond to the history of the Satan, the spirit. If compare the two mythologies, nobody can deny that the history written by Hubbard is in fact very near to the Gnostic mythology. But we can say that in many other cases, Hubbard manifests his Gnosticism in theoretical way. For example, by that expression Zerg, we find in the book Scientology 8008. Ron Hubbard sums us very well the essence of Gnosticism. He writes, any human being is an universe in itself, and in itself possesses all the possibilities of an universe. This spiritual expansion of the self till to touch all the potentialities of the universe reveals the infinity of the spirit. Indeed, what about the nature of Gnosticism? The very nature of Gnosticism is perhaps this universe in us that is infinite, like a category of the spirit, or according to Jung, is similar to an archetype of our unconscious. It refers to the idea that our mind is a segment of the deepest unconscious mind, which is the genetically inherited and not shaped by personal experience. In this way, I would suppose that the Gnosticism in Hubbard's view can be generated from the death of the spirit without any contact with the very history of Gnosticism. That is my hypothesis. That happens because the Greek Gnosis auton is so deep the source of our life, that is like the archetype in us present ab immemorabile. Jung would sustain this thesis. At this point, we need to insert one note about the Gnosticism. as credited by Pope Francis in Esortazione Apostolica Gaudete et Exultate. In the chapter 2, dedicated to modern Gnosticism, he writes, this is neo by me. Gnosticism presumes for Pope Francis a purely subjective faith, I cite, whose only interest is a certain experience or a set of ideas and bits of information which are means to console and enlighten, but which ultimately keep one imprisoned in his own thoughts and feelings. This says Pope Francis. From these new words, anyone can highlight that Pope Francis stresses one side of Gnosticism and not the classic vision connected with Platonism, the great vision which expresses the nearness between human being and divine, the Anim and the spirit, the Atman and Brahman. A classic Christian tradition vision is as contrary based on Aristotle, and like to that of Pope Francis, it is essentially dichotomous. Other is the man, and the other is God. This is the eternal difference. But we observe that the Christians of the Church of the origins knew different ideas about this great problem. For example, you can see Origen or the Bishop Irenaeus in Contra Hereses. They were not so clear in the difference and in the otherness between God and the spirit of man. At least the same St. Augustine would not be conformed with the ideas of Pope Francis, ideas which were not spiritualist and not mystic in their principles. Spiritual is to see how the feeling of I is a product of thought. Most people look inside, notice nothing of interest, and conclude that introspection is a dead end. I think it should be sufficient to recognize that we are our thoughts and the spirituality is already present. According to Jung's teachings, at the contrary, our very thought is the collective unconscious, common to all human beings, in the responsible for a number of deep-seated beliefs and instincts, such as spirituality, such as the deepest ideas of all religions. Come to this point, we have to note another particularity that needs to be investigated, the perennial philosophy. Surely, the unconscious of Jung is not the unconscious of Hubbard. In the first case, the unconscious means deep in the mind, innate. universal, immemorial, primal symbol, and corresponds to an exemplary paragraphs of Platon's Platonic idols. In the second case, in Hubbard's view, unconscious belief belongs to the reactive mind and is the cause of our errors and our negativity. Only the cognitive science, the word unconscious, knows a rehabilitation. But in another sense, the idea of Jung, unconscious, is not proper unconscious, but the overconscious, present too in Hubbard, like in the cognitive science. That is the deep of memory, the ego of past lives, the eternal, the immortal, in certain aspects, the a priori of mind, Rudolf Otto. Now we have to investigate what means perennial philosophy. For that view, where Gnosticism and the Scientology are convergent, they have perhaps the same nature, in the deep of the spirit. Therefore, I would dedicate essentially one small reflection. In particular, I would present only a single idea about the relationship between classic Gnosticism and the Scientology, noting that Scientology and the Gnosticism both would belong to perennial philosophy. In other topics of mine discussed the comparative theories of Bednarovsky, Hugh Urban, with the neo-Gnostic religion like Otto, Madame Blavatsky, Gnostic theology. In this case, I would like to speak of a single expression in the definition of Gnosticism, which has impressed me very much. The same expression would apply to Scientology. The expression has been coined from the great scholar of Gnosticism, the Dutch Gill Quispel, who defined the Gnostic worldview as the mystische Ausdruck der Selbsterfahrung. What is to say about this? This definition of Gnosticism is not far from the same definition that would be proper of Scientology. All is dependent from the core of problem, that is the mystical and the mythical dimension, where the light of higher reality shines and appears to the man and to the spirit, and therefore the connection between interior experience and the supreme vision of reality are present. Perhaps this expression may be influenced by Jung's interpretation of Gnosticism, who pretends Gnosticism is science and religion. But it's another time too. The answer is that Jung thought it may very well be both. Gnosticism, a religion, and Gnosticism as psychology. In fact, the epistemological collocation in psychology involved in this contest presumes the expression of the self is a universal constant of human mind. And this is like to perennial philosophy, human mind. In this way, the Gnostic doctrine, considered as the expression of the spirit itself, is an important bridge from Gnosticism to perennial philosophy. From other side, the definition of Gnosticism as Selbsterfahrung shelters from academic perspective and objection, where the very idea of history of truth might appear contradictory. How can truth be absolute and at the same time subjected to historical development? The deep of the self-experience is something immune from time, history, and historical development, because it touches the divine. It is something like a revelation. We must think in this direction. Only if we understand Gnosticism in its proximity to very knowledge and the revelation, we can near to the perennial philosophy. Otto says inner revelation, inner Offenbarung. The focus of these talks is on Jung's study and the use of Gnostic mythology. During his work on mythology, he immediately reveals his membership to the perennial philosophy. In fact, Jung rejects the mind as tabula rasa. On the other side, Jung interprets Eastern religions and confirms the Gnosticism of Eastern religion corresponded to Selbsterfahrung as knowledge, or better, insight knowledge. The same does Hubbard in Phoenix Lecture. Eastern religions are based on insight knowledge. This affirmed priority of knowledge in Eastern religions is very luminant. The first verse of Dhammapada says, all that we are is the result of the mind. All we are, it is found in our mind. All we made, it is made up by our mind. The great fact is in that we have a precise registration of the same in Phoenix Lecture by Hubbard. Hubbard repeat this priority of knowledge in Eastern religion. The great fact is that we have a precise registration of the same in Phoenix Lecture. So, the total Gnosticism included in this verse of Dhammapada is recorded by Ron Hubbard's view, who repeated the same. So the Selbsterfahrung of Jung is at least the incipit of the Dhammapada. Jung wrote a number of books in article, like Tibetan Book of the Dead, Yoga, and Eastern religion. He contributed forwards to books on Zen Buddhism that have same direction. He note unconscious is also this specifically by interpreting new famous stories and myths found in scriptures. That is all that I would say about illumination, insight, knowledge, or self-found. Conclusion: sharing the perennial philosophy. Carl Jung is associated with the perennial philosophy, explained the Gnostic faith from a psychological standpoint. Jung's analytical psychology, in many ways, schematically, thus mirror the ancient Gnostic mythology, particularly those of Valentinus and the classic Gnostic doctrine described in most detail in the Apocryphon of John. Thus, I come to end. Jung understands the emergence of the demiurge out of the original, unified monadic source of the spiritual universe, and sees this as the ego from the unconscious. Perennial tradition is the connection between Gnosticism and Scientology. What is perennial philosophy? Only the last note is a perspective on spirituality, sharing the truth of origin from which any knowledge is born. Aldous Huxley, which is universalistic interpretation of world religions, is the basic of this vision. The principle is all is one, like in the Sanskrit formula Tat Tvam Asi. The expression in the Renaissance, coined by Italian humanist Agostino Sterco, was Prisca Theologia, and he intended to mean that there is an eternal core of shared wisdom in all religions. This is perennial philosophy. This multiple denomination is a symbol of the importance of antiquity signification we have to attribute to esoteric and mystic reality, unifying all religions. Surely, and I conclude, Gnosticism and Scientology belong to this great tradition. Thank you.
For your very interesting presentation, I already see in the reaction from the audience that they enjoyed your speech very much. But I believe we will do the way as very often we do, is that we allow for the audience to ask the questions. You can write in the chat, and then I will see and raise the questions with the speakers. But now I will give the floor. We will raise all the questions at the end of the session. So now I will give the floor to the second speaker, who is Massimo Introvigne. Massimo Introvigne is Italian sociologist of religion, and he is the managing director of CESNO, the Center for Studies on New Religions. He will talk to us through Hubbard's adventures in his early years with various Gnostic groups. The floor is yours, please.
I was visited by a Chinese scholar who is engaged in the Chinese controversy against cults on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And he is a scholar with a good knowledge of Christianity. and told me he had found a very good weapon to use against cults, and it is to call them Gnostic. And I told him that that may work with some Christian groups, because in some Christian traditions, Gnosticism is not a good word, but I knew at least one new religious movement which is actually very happy when it's called Gnostic, and that's the Church of Scientology. The book by Aldo Natale Terrin of 2017 was very well received by Scientologists, and so were earlier articles by J. Gordon Melton and Régis Derichebourg that presented Scientology as a modern form of Gnosticism. It is, however, true that there is an episode in the life of L. Ron Hubbard and in his exploration of different religious and spiritual traditions, including Gnostic, that Scientologists do not particularly like. And it is the short association of L. Ron Hubbard in 1945 with something called Agape Lodge, part of an occult organization called Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO. Now, the OTO is an organization with a long history. We have no time to discuss here, but in 1945 he had come under the control of Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley is a very important figure in the history of modern esotericism, but until at least the 1980s, 1990s, his image was uniformly negative. Crowley was somebody who liked, as the French would say, to épater le bourgeois, and he was very happy when he was called in British tabloids the great beast of the wickedest men in the world. It is important, before we proceed further, to understand that this image of Crowley is totally different from the image scholars have now. Today, scholars will recognize that Crowley was not a good character in his private life, for instance, in his treatment of women, but Crowley was a very important figure in the development of Western esotericism. So, while during the lifetime of L. Ron Hubbard, for Hubbard to be associated in any way with Crowley was extremely disreputable, paradoxically the situation will be totally different today. There is an association of scholars devoted to the academic study of Crowley. There are no association of scholars devoted to the academic study of Hubbard, and there are surely more university courses or edited books by academic presses about Crowley than they are about Hubbard. So today the assessment of Crowley is totally different, and it's important to keep this in mind when telling the story of Hubbard's relations with Crowley and his disciples. Crowley visited several times the United States and always had followers there, particularly in California, when in 1934 Wilfred Talbot Smith founded the Church of Telema, and in 1935 the Agape Lodge of the OTO, which would have remained just one among many OTO lodges had it not been joined in 1941 by Marvel Whiteside Parsons, commonly known as Jack Parsons, who was an important scientist. There is a crater on the moon named after Jack Parsons, and he was a very important figure in the development of American rockets. Parsons was also a communist, which was somewhat contradictory with his being a millionaire because of the royalties on these discoveries and working for the US military. And he was a womanizer and a theoretician of sexual freedom. He has a wife, Helen Coley, not Crowley, and he also slept with the teenager half-sister of his wife, called Betty Northrop, which was dangerous because the father of Betty Northrop, which was not the father of his wife, they were half-sisters, was an informant of the American intelligence services. 1942, Parsons bought a very luxurious residence in what was called Pasadena's Millionaire Row and started living communally with other OTO members. In 1945, through a friend who was the musical composer Roy Leffingwell, Hubbard visited this sort of community. He liked it and decided to join and to live in this, to take a room in this very comfortable home. He became a friend of Parsons, and Parsons asked him to record some magical rituals based on the Elizabethan magus John Dee's works and aimed at making a nature spirit, an elemental appear. Well, no elemental appeared, but a beautiful woman called Marjorie Cameron knocked at the door of the community and eventually became Parsons' new lover. So Parsons declared the ritual had worked because Cameron had appeared, and Cameron went on to become a very famous American sculptor with exhibition in most of the mainline museums. So Parsons, who was like Crowley into sex magic, started a series of magical experiments with Cameron, and meanwhile Hubbard and Betty Northrop, that was the young sister of Parsons' legal wife, fell in love and developed several commercial ventures, in one of which Parsons invested some money. It was a venture playing on the difference of prices of boats between California and Florida and taking boats in California and taking them to Florida. Now here we have two narratives of what happened in 46 when Hubbard and Betty on one side and Parsons parted company. Parsons believed that they defrauded him of his money, and Hubbard and Betty said they were fed up with his antics. Eventually, the matter reached a judge in Miami, Florida, which decided that Hubbard had not defrauded Parsons. It was just, as it happens in the best of families, a business relations gone bad, and so the judge divided the assets of the company between Parsons and Hubbard. Parsons never met Hubbard after this incident, and in 1952 died in the accidental explosion of his chemical laboratory. Betty remained with Hubbard for a while, They married validly or not. There was some confusion on a previous divorce by Hubbard. And Betty was with Hubbard as he was developing the early Dianetics. But she started befriending a strange circle, which would deserve another paper, of communists who were interested in Dianetics and eventually became the lover of one of them, Miles Hollister. And interestingly, but anecdotically, another member of this group of communists interested in Dianetics was Gregory Hemingway, a medical doctor and the son of the famous writer Ernest Hemingway, which will become famous later as one of the first American transsexual to legally change his sex and name and become Gloria Hemingway. So, because Hubbard was suspicious that these communists were infiltrating Dianetics for espionage purposes on behalf of Soviet Russia, and because Betty was sleeping with Hollister, Hubbard and Betty also parted company. All these incidents were long forgotten in subsequent years when Hubbard devoted his time to developing the technology of Dianetics and Scientology until 1969 and an obscure episode of that year. In that year, a young man called Alex Mitchell, who was the editor of a controversial Trotskyist communist newspaper in London, but probably was at the same time an agent of the British Secret Services, offered to the Sunday Times a sensational report about Hubbard's involvement in a black magic group, perhaps Satanist, led by the notorious Aleister Crowley. And he had been told, probably by an associate of Crowley called Gerald York, that some of the original documents of the Californian Lodge were actually in a London library. So the article was published, and Hubbard and Scientology reacted very strongly. They asked the Sunday Times to publish a letter where it was stated that Hubbard, if anything, had destroyed a black magic organization, the Agape Lodge, and had rescued a young girl who was manipulated and exploited there. Now, the opponents of Hubbard have consistently written that this claim was pure propaganda and ridiculous. Actually, it was not totally false, because it is true that Hubbard, while pursuing his own interest in the Agape Lodge, was telling the peccadillos of Parsons to the father of Betty, who, as I mentioned it before, was not only concerned about the moral well-being of his younger daughter, but was also connected with the intelligence service. The story doesn't end here, because opponent of Hubbard continued to insist that he had been connected with the sinister Aleister Crowley, and were able to quote a speech Hubbard published himself of December 5, 1952, in which he discussed magic. And he said that the late Aleister Crowley, I quote, was my very good friend, and produced, I quote, a splendid piece of aesthetics, even if Hubbard, in this and other texts, also said that magic, and in particular Crowley's magic, didn't really solve the human problems. So the question is, how do we reconcile the claim in the 1952 lecture by Hubbard that Crowley was his friend. Well, the two of them never met personally, but knew of each other through Parsons, and produced a splendid piece of aesthetics with the press release Scientology sent to the Sunday Times in 1969, saying that the OTO was a sinister cult and Hubbard helped destroying it. Well, one possible explanation is that a press release is a different literary genre with respect to a theoretical lecture. Another possibility is that Hubbard in 45 or 52 didn't know a lot about Crowley, but knew more about the less palatable aspects of his private life in 1969. But I would prefer a third explanation, and the third explanation is that Hubbard's assessment of Crowley very much agrees with the assessment of Crowley in modern scholarship. On the one hand, what Scientology wrote in 69, that Crowley was a dark character, is true. His private life, by any standard, was horrible. But on the other hand, that Crowley was capable of producing splendid pieces of aesthetics is also true. An exhibition of his paintings has been hosted by the Biennale in Venice. And it is also true that Hubbard had what Hubbard said about Crowley being very important in the history of magic. Now, I believe that critics of Hubbard, and even some scholars, such as Hugh Urban, who has written about the incident, have been so mesmerized by the fact of the association between Hubbard and an OTO lodge that they have not examined the content of what Hubbard exactly said about Crowley's magic and magic in general. I have often argued that there is something very important to understand Hubbard that many do not consider, and that's Hubbard's fiction. If we look at fiction, we see that Hubbard had developed an interest in things magical many years before having heard the very name of Crowley or Parsons. And there are different texts, but the most significant one is a short story called Slaves of Sleep, published in 1939. It is about the magical seal of Solomon and Athanasius Kircher's interpretation of Kabbalah, and is clearly influenced, and I say avowedly, Hubbard said it, by Washington Irving and a tale by Irving called The Legend of Enchanted Soldier. And when Hubbard published Slaves of Sleep, not again the date, 1939, he put a note on it about magic, saying that magic should not be quickly dismissed, but ultimately is of doubtful utility. So we see that these ideas about magic were something Hubbard was already developing many years before Dianetics, and also many years before his adventure in Pasadena. Ultimately, what was the attitude of Hubbard about magic? And again, I would say it's a very modern attitude and agrees with a good part of modern scholarship of esotericism. In an article published in the Ability magazine in 1957, Hubbard said that we all live in a trap called physical universe. As Rosita said, that's vintage Scientology, and we should find a way to walk out of this trap. And Hubbard said all religions, Christianity, Buddhism, they were successful because they proposed a way out of this trap, but in the 20th century, many didn't find this way effective. And so some looked magic, proposed an alternative way to walk out of the trap of physical existence. But ultimately, magic can work because magic offers, dismissed, I would say, disparagingly, but this solution remains on the effects, while Hubbard was in moving from the side of effect to the side of the cause. So in this interesting text, Hubbard used the word super magic, saying if you really want to open the gate, perhaps traditional religion is not enough. So you may be tempted to turn to magic, but even magic is not enough. You need super magic and something which works as a technology without belief and without faith. And this super magic is something we can also call Gnosticism. So I believe that this discussion, which was launched by opponents of Scientology to slander Hubbard, may lead us into much more interesting observation about the relation between three different ways out of the prison of the physical universe: religion, magic, and super magic of Gnosticism. Was Hubbard interested in magic? Yes, he was interested in pretty much everything, so it will be strange it will not be interested in something so important in all traditions such as magic. But was Hubbard a magical thinker? The answer is no. He was a Gnostic thinker. Scientology is a Gnostic religion, not a magical system. And I will quote a German scholar who is quite critical of Scientology, but got it wrong on this point, Mario Frenchkowski, who wrote in 2000 that Scientology is something very different from magic, and magic is no magical key to understand what Scientology is all about. But perhaps Gnosticism is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Antolini. As always, it's very interesting and to listen to your presentations, and also you give so many interesting facts. Now I will give the floor to our third speaker, who is Eric Roux. And Eric Roux will offer us an insider perspective, as himself he is a Scientologist. At the same time, Eric is a scholar who had published important studies on Hubbard, and he is also a religious liberty activist. So it's a very interesting personality. So when I give the floor to Eric Roux, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosita. Thank you, Massimo. Thank you, Professor Terim. So I would start by a quote, and the quote is: "Scientology is a Gnostic faith, in that it knows that it knows." Those are the words written by L. Ron Hubbard in March 55 and it was published from Phoenix, Arizona, in the Dianetics and Scientology magazine called Ability. And the article from which that quote is accepted is called The Scientologist, a Manual on the Dissemination of Material. So while this assertion on Gnosticism might seem obscure at first sight, it in fact reveals a profound truth regarding Scientology. Further in the article, Hubbard clarifies why knowing that you know would result in belonging to a Gnostic faith. And he says, as Scientologists, we are Gnostics, which is to say that we know that we know. People in the ministry ordinarily suppose that knowingness and knowledge are elsewhere resident than in themselves. They believe in belief and substitute belief for wisdom. This makes Scientology no less a religion, but makes it a religion with an older tradition and puts it on an intellectual plane. End of quote. The Greek meaning of gnosis is knowledge and or awareness, as gnosis is more a personal and direct knowledge than a superficial or second-hand one. It's a knowledge that is an awareness. Gnosis or Gnosticism, I still ask myself what is the difference and if somebody can answer. For me, it's complete synonym, but anyway. So Gnosis or Gnosticism is a form of knowledge that is not speculative. It is knowledge that arises from observation and experience through an inner subjective process leading to self-knowledge. If we follow these few lines, Scientology is Gnostic, without a doubt. Scientology axioms begin with the first axiom of Scientology actually is life is basically a static. Definition of a static: a life static has no mass, no motion, no wavelength, no location in space or in time. It has the ability to postulate and to perceive. That is the first axiom. And then we have axiom 23, which adds, I quote, the static has the capability of total knowingness. These two axioms alone tell us that Scientology postulates the idea that to know oneself is to recover the capacity to know completely. And this knowingness is, and I quote again, pure knowingness, which is not influenced by space or energy. It's Aaron Hubbard who said that in something which is called the gradient scale of knowingness. So there is indeed in Scientology a quest for liberating knowledge, a desire to transcend the consequences of a kind of spiritual fall which has made the spirit prisoner of its own traps, and which can only make one think of the inclinations of the ancient Gnostics. Of course, Scientology is a religion of the 20th century. So its quest for knowledge, therefore, necessarily involves other tools than those that existed in ancient Greece or in the early days of the Christian era. And this is perhaps also why some authors see it as a culmination, or at least a modern breakthrough emerging from the long Gnostic tradition. This Scientology religion, that the Catholic theologian Michel de Certeau called a spiritualism founded on an infinite being, before adding, I admired this articulation between ethical concerns, a search for wisdom, and technical learning, is a religion founded on the many axioms that can be found in the hundreds of thousands of pages written by its founder. Scientology Hubbard writes in the magazine Ability of March 55, which I already quoted, is the science of knowing how to know. It is, the science of knowing how to know answers. It is an organized system of axioms and processes which resolve the problems of existence. This makes Scientology a rational gnosis. It leads to a state of knowingness, gradually by the means of what is called a technology. And this knowingness, of course, can lead to resolving the problems of existence. But the way to achieve this knowingness is rational, codified, and can be attained gradually by the application of processes, which is to say, a set of thousands of progressive spiritual exercises. This concern for classification and ordering by L. Ron Hubbard and the engineering spirit with which he conceived and communicated Scientology certainly makes it the most codified of all the religions of the world. In Scientology, there are also many scales which comes from the observation of spiritual phenomena as it exists in Scientology. One of these scales, published in 54, is the gradient scale of knowingness. And let me tell you what is written in this scale. So at the top of the scale, you have pure knowingness that is not influenced by space or energy. Then you go down the scale and you have knowingness, which is already influenced and cut down by space. Then you go down the scale and you get knowingness, which is cut down by space and energy. And then you go to the bottom of the scale and you have knowingness, which is dropped to a point of where it is cut to practically nothing by the continued existence of practically no space and tremendous quantity of energy. And this equals to stupidity. So actually, if you read it from the bottom up, it shows the path of knowledge-based salvation that the sleeping mind follows as it gradually ascends to full spiritual freedom through Scientology technology. And if you read it from the top to the bottom, it finally describes the fall found in the Gnostic writings. In the aforementioned text of Ability, March 55, L. Ron Hubbard writes, among the capability and potentials of the thetan, and there I'm going to define thetan. I think it has already been done before, maybe even by Rosita at the beginning, but let me tell you that the thetan, it comes from the Greek letter theta, which means thought or life or the spirit, is the spiritual being, the person himself, not his body, not his name, not the physical universe, not his mind, not anything else. It is the thing that is aware of being aware. It is the identity which is the individual. One does not have a thetan. It is not something one keeps somewhere apart from oneself. The person is a thetan. So I come back to the quote. Among the capabilities and potentials of the thetan is immortality in full knowingness of his own identity. The amount of time he has spent on earth and the number of deaths through which he has gone have brought him into a state of forgetfulness about who and where he has been. This material is recovered in Scientology if the Scientologist specifically processes toward it. End of quote. Immortality of the soul, reincarnation, forgetfulness of its inner being are concepts that are found in Gnosis. Scientology, as a Gnostic faith, has brought them to a science of knowing how to know, meaning how to create a direct knowingness of spiritual matters as well as of one's divine nature. And you do that through the use of a spiritual technology that is aimed at creating personal freedom for the spiritual being himself. Of course, if you know how to know, then you may know that you know. And that's how Scientology aligns ancient Gnosis goals with a modern and rational approach. The result of Scientology is knowingness, awareness, and personal freedom for the individual, which is to mean Gnosis. And that was the end of what I wanted to tell you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. So it was very interesting and passionate how you present your ideas. So it was a lot of pleasure to listen to you. The audience is quite quite active in enjoying, expressing the joy to listen the presentations, and most of them they say that they have really learned a lot and they find the things very interesting. I totally agree with them. I see one question, and before I read the question, so I call to the audience to raise more questions that we would have discussion between ourselves, because we still could have something like half an hour. So it's I invite to be active and participate in the discussion. Now the question is for Professor Giovanni, and the person who asked, he said that maybe the question to others as well. Can you explain why, for certain religious traditions, Gnosticism is seen as something negative? So it was to Professor Giovanni, but if somebody else also after him would like to step in, it would be interesting to hear your opinion. So, Professor Giovanni.
Well, basically, it all depends how you define Gnosticism. You can define Gnosticism as just a way of looking at your religious tradition, and in this sense, it is compatible with all main religious traditions. However, for this approach, most religious tradition will talk of gnosis or gnose and not of Gnosticism. By Gnosticism, it was intended a system of theological and philosophical principles which organized in smaller or larger groups in the first Christian centuries. And there is little doubt that Gnosticism as an organized movement was different from Christianity and was a competitor of Christianity. And nobody likes competitors. So the church fathers considered Gnosticism as a competing religion, but at that time people were not very much about ecumenical dialogue, so competition was dismissed as a heresy. And if you proposed a different system from the one the church approved, you were branded as an heretic. And this tradition, of course, has continued. I see Aldo Natale Perrin may disagree, but he is an individual theologian, and in official documents of the Catholic Church, even in recent speeches by Pope Francis, we see the word Gnosticism used with a negative meaning. But as I said, it all depends how you define Gnosticism. If it's just a way of looking at things, nobody should be scared of it. But if it's an organized system, it is alternative to other religions, and it's not surprising that the Christians in particular would regard Gnosticism as an enemy or a dangerous competitor or an heresy, or in modern terms as a cult.
Would the others like to add something? React? No? Professor Turin? No? Very true. Okay, thank you. I have a question addressed to Professor Turin. The question is, can the idea of Titan in Scientology be compared to the idea of soul of Plotinus? The floor is yours, Professor.
Which is the question in few words? I would to say, to know. Perhaps intervene maybe not help me in this question.
Professor Turin.
The question, I would like to know the question. Non sento più. I have not understanding.
Do you have one?
Voilà. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
La domanda in italiano è se l'idea del Tetan in Scientology è la stessa o può essere paragonata all'idea di anima in Plotino. Se vuoi rispondere in italiano, io traduco in inglese.
Bravo, perché mi sembra proprio che sia vicina all'idea di Plotino e l'anima. Naturalmente c'è tutto il discorso orientale che è sotto a Plotino e che ci riporta alle origini del discorso che anche Ron Hubbard fa. Cioè Ron Hubbard non passa attraverso le mediazioni di Plotino, ma va direttamente all'Oriente. Ho citato il Dhammapada, ma è proprio lì che Ron Hubbard coglie l'idea che la mente è un assoluto, come l'Oriente, come in Oriente. L'Atman e il Brahman. L'Atman e il Brahman fondamentalmente significa proprio questo. L'Atman è l'anima, è lo spirituale che è in noi, che si configura poi come il trascendentale, il cosmico, universale, come lo spirito universale. E dunque, dicono gli orientali, chi ha capito che l'Atman è uguale al Brahman, che l'anima, come dire, è simile, è la stessa cosa che è lo stesso che dire Dio, ha capito tutto, e addirittura è già salvo. Ecco, se puoi spiegare questa idea forse.
So the short answer to the question is yes, that it's similar to Plotinus, but behind Plotinus there is an Eastern tradition. And Hubbard didn't pass through Plotinus, but he went back to the source of Plotinus, who is in the Eastern tradition. And Professor Terrini in his speech quoted Dhammapada, and the key principle here is that Atman is the same as Brahman. What does it mean? It means that the soul in humans is really the same as God. And if we can grasp this identification between the soul and the cosmic, the transcendental principle God, we have grasped everything that needs to be grasped.
Occorre dire che forse Papa Francesco, quando ha scritto nel 2018 questa esortazione apostolica, fa vedere che non è uno spiritualista, perché non riesce a cogliere il senso della conoscenza gnostica. La conoscenza gnostica è spirituale, è talmente spirituale che non permette neppure di essere, addirittura il Papa dice, sono informazioni, bit addirittura di informazioni. È una bestemmia dire che il gnosticismo è fatto di bit di informazioni, perché è proprio il contrario, è proprio una spiritualità eccezionale, quella del gnosticismo, che si rivela proprio nell'idea di conoscenza. La conoscenza è interiore, è spirituale, è rivelazione. Se puoi dire, puoi dire?
About the Pope's negative evaluation of Gnosticism, Professor Terrin said the Pope is not very spiritualist, but spiritualist in English has another sense, so I would translate freely. His main interest is not the spiritual dimension, perhaps it's more about the social dimension. And so he is not well placed to grasp the depth of Gnosticism. And this is Gnosticism as a set of formation, which according to Professor Terrin is deeply wrong, because Gnosticism is not about information, but it's about a spiritual approach, a point of view, a transcendence. And once you see Gnosticism in these terms, the way of approaching and evaluating it will be totally different.
Grazie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions from the audience. Now perhaps I would ask the speakers, perhaps you would like to say something as closing remarks.
Come?
Massimo, can you...
Se vogliamo dire qualche parola ognuno di noi a titolo di conclusione.
Would you, Professor Tevin?
Yeah. Dico che questo convegno è stato molto interessante, perché ha messo a fuoco alcuni dei punti fondamentali, e cioè riporta la visione di Ron Hubbard alla vera spiritualità che lo supporta, che non è soltanto fatta di pragmatismo, di etica, di morale sociale, ma è basato su un'idea profondissima di conoscenza che è il senso profondo dello spirituale e che non si confonde con puro umanesimo. Si pensi anche a quello che ha scritto Sloterdijk. Sloterdijk ha dedicato una ventina di pagine a Ron Hubbard, ma fa vedere, contrariamente a quanto dice, che le religioni sono ormai un umanesimo di un'atletica e che Ron Hubbard avrebbe tradotto bene le sue idee di Sloterdijk, parlando delle religioni come di umanesimi e di una spinta verso l'alto, verso un'atletica che fa fare esercizi all'uomo per diventare più uomo. Io dico no, che questo è vero soltanto in parte e che Ron Hubbard aveva una spiritualità che era molto forte, forse si ispirava a Valdo, alla corrente dell'Ottocento, ma era una grande spiritualità e non si può mettere in dubbio con queste idee così vagabonde di Sloterdijk. Grazie.
Yeah, I'll try to translate or perhaps summarize. Professor Terrin believes this webinar is very important because it goes to the very root of the religious ideas of L. Ron Hubbard, and these ideas are not only pragmatic, are not only about ethics or morality, are not only practical, but they have a very deep religious dimension, which we subsumed under the word of Gnosticism. One point Professor Terrin wanted to make is Hubbard's religious ideas are not merely humanistic. And he opened a discussion with Sloterdijk. Sloterdijk, for those who don't know him, is an important German philosopher, and is one who has devoted some 20 pages of one of his book to Scientology. But his approach to Scientology is a sort of a reductionist, because for him what Hubbard did was to propose a sort of humanism or ethical self-transformation and call it a religion. So the approach of Sloterdijk is also a critical one, though it's one that at least takes Hubbard seriously. But Professor Terrin believes this approach is wrong because it focuses on the humanist ethical dimension of Hubbard and Scientology and ignores the deeper transcendental and spiritual dimension, which surely is not less important.
Thank you, grazie.
Thank you so much. Would you, Professor Giovanni and Eric Rue, would like to say something for conclusion of our meeting today?
Just very shortly, I believe that's part of something that Donald Westbrook, who is a very promising young scholar who has already published a book with Oxford University Press about not so much Scientology, but the Scientologists, called Scientology 2.0. And why Scientology 2.0? Because for many, many years, and that's still going on at the level of the opponents, which are becoming particularly boring and repetitious, all discussion about Hubbard has focused on controversies and legal problems and conflicts with anti-cultists and with some governmental anti-cult campaigns. Now, that's not without interest, of course, but we should realize that it tells us not very little, actually, of what Hubbard was all about, what were his ideas, and why his ideas became significant for thousands and thousands of people in different countries, different professions, including that's something I have studied for artists in the different fields of the art, but of course not only artists. So, of course, we can expect the opponents to continue to focus only on some controversial aspects, but I believe for those who think and those who really want to learn about Hubbard and Scientology, it's great time to move on and to move to a consideration of what were Hubbard's key ideas, and of course what were the roots of Hubbard's key ideas. I believe Professor Terrin's book, unfortunately available only in Italian, was a very significant step towards the building of this Scientology 2.0 scholarly paradigm. And of course, this is contrasted by people who are not interested in clarifying what Hubbard was all about. They only want to prevent people from approaching the ideas of Erwin Hubbard. But ultimately, that's not important. It's annoying, but it's not important. And so I hope this webinar would open the way to other webinars where we can explore other important features of L. Ron Hubbard's and Scientology's thought and activities.
Thank you very much, Professor Antonini, and thank you for your suggestion. I believe that this really very high quality debate today, it's very useful and very interesting for the audience, and the audience is very enthusiastic about all the presentations. So Eric, would you like to say something?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm not sure that comparing Scientology to Gnosticism is crucial in understanding Scientology, because of course you can just study Scientology and understand it. Nevertheless, and maybe it can be seen from this conference or this webinar, it gives a very interesting hint at what is Scientology in terms of spiritual tradition. Because as you can see, the tradition to seek for freedom, spiritual freedom, and spiritual knowledge and full knowledge is a long tradition. And I thought, listening to Massimo just a few seconds before, that it's interesting to see that any movement that has claimed at one point that it could bring freedom and it could bring self-knowledge and full knowledge, I'm speaking about spiritual knowledge, has been heavily combated. We spoke about Plotinus, Plotinus was heavily combated to the point where his students were persecuted, his school was closed, maybe burnt, I don't remember. But all this, there is this, and we speak about Gnosis, and this is what happened to Gnosis. It has been persecuted and considered by other in a more established or in the establishment as opponent or as a concurrent, dangerous concurrent. So I think it's interesting to see that first, Scientology is belonging to a long tradition of spirituals seekers, and also that this kind of tradition has always been combated. And of course, we could speak much more about it, but I think it's enough for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. I believe it's really amazing was amazing webinar that we can really learn a lot, and I learned a lot. So for me, it's a great honor to be called as moderator for a quality event. There is a small question. I don't know. It's like perhaps Professor Introvini can help to translate to Professor Turin. And the question is about, is there any plan to publish Professor Turin's work in English or other languages? Can you help us with this?
Sì, è una domanda pratica per il professor Terrin, se ha in programma la traduzione del suo libro in inglese o in altre lingue.
Sì, è in programma, però bisogna aspettare che tutti siano d'accordo, perché non tutti sono d'accordo, ma penso che presto verrà tradotto.
He says it's part of his programs, but everybody should agree, the publisher and foreign publisher, but he hopes soon there will be a translation of the book.
Thank you so much. Looking very much forward. So we look very much forward to organize other really interesting debates as we had today. So thank you for the audience of their support, of their nice and nice words to the speakers and to the organizers. So thank you so much. It was a big pleasure to be with you, and see you next time. Bye bye.